Today I'm looking at all these blue icons. This is visual feedback for various kinds of buffs and status effects that are going on in Warframe. As you'll see, this is changing, they are disappearing. There are numbers that are flickering and changing and counting down. Some of these are showing percentages, some of them are showing multipliers. They move, they shift. It's very hard to read when you are actually playing the game, actually trying to kill enemies and whatnot. It's a carryover from an older time perhaps, but anyway, let's go back to Mirage and a fairly basic setup in a mission where even though we have other people playing, they're really not providing me with any kind of buffs or anything. That's often not the case. Basically, we have a row of icons, some of which are useful to us, some of which are not. This is a buff that happens when I switch between my melee weapon and my range weapon, primary or secondary, basically shooty weapons as opposed to hitty weapons. I know that that's vigorous swap is what it's called because it's 165%. That's how I know the icon is pretty meaningless to me. This is a buff that happens every time I kill an enemy with these. She has these holographic clones that fight alongside her. As they kill enemies, they stack up a buff. This is going to be a theme that's going to be repeated over and over again. I don't really need this icon to be here, and that's a theme that's going to come up over and over again. This is, and this will go away when this ability runs down. So there's a timer down here. It's currently on 39 seconds. When this ability goes away, this ability will reset to 0 and it'll build up over time and max out at 50%. But it's basically another damage buff. A lot of these things are going to be damage buffs of some kind. This one shows me that my companion, and somewhere there's a blue icon on the map there. It's very hard to see on this footage where my companion is. But basically, Warframe lets you have these companions. They can be robots, they can be creatures. There it is, there. That's my robotic companion. It has the ability to pick up health orbs, which is like drops in games like health packs kind of thing. Most games have some equivalent of that. And when it does pick up a health orb, it triggers other effects. And if those other effects were being triggered, I would know about it. I don't really want to go too far in the weeds with that. But basically that icon is pointless to me. I don't need to see that at all. The next one here is a thing called Eclipse. This is a straight up damage buff. And I will come back to this one because this is going to be a key point of contention. But basically this is a straight up damage buff. And then we get into these things over here, and these are all various kinds of damage buffs that are contingent on you killing enemies, in some cases with certain kinds of weapons. So these ones give you damage to your ranged weapons. This one's secondary, this one's primary. Doesn't really, you're not going to distinguish. They're always going to be the same buff. It's always going to be the same number. In this case, it's actually fading away because I haven't actually meleeed any enemies recently. These two are ranged weapon buffs. One of them is multi-shot, which basically means every bullet is potentially multiple bullets, and the other one's about status effect, which is where you get status effects on enemies that are going to do things like damage over time. And these are important because these are the ones that I really want to see that I can maintain them at their maximum amount. Like the 5 times and the 2 times, that's the maximum for those two. These ones actually go up to 6 times, trying to keep them as high as possible all the time, and they time out if you're not killing enemies, which gets problematic in like boss battles, for example. It really doesn't matter so much on this. This is a relatively low level battle, especially for this particular Warframe, playing pretty casually here, but against high level enemies you want to be keeping these high multipliers all the time. However, trying to see these in amongst a whole bunch of other icons is problematic. Here we have Wukong. Wukong has maybe a similar number, maybe slightly more than Mirage. Has the same weapon buffs triggered by kills. A couple of icons that I'm not even 100% sure what they are. They, if you look these up, and it's hard to find reference material on these, but if you look these up, there's a whole bunch of things these could be. I'm pretty sure I know what they are. They're something to do with critical damage buffs, probably. But it's very hard to see. And even when I went back and replayed the footage, because you'll notice here, for example, this actually tells me that that vigorous swap is triggering. That's the one where you swap between the melee and the ranged weapon and you get this damage buff. It actually tells you momentarily the name of the buff before that text description gradually fades out. With these ones, even on the review footage, I couldn't actually tell what they were. This is a damage reduction buff against impact damage. That's actually not too bad to read, but I'll show you an example in a moment where if you get a few of those going on the screen, and it's messy and it's questionable how useful it is that I be told that. There's not a huge amount that I can do about this, except maybe run into a bunch of enemies and take a bunch of damage in order to keep this damage reduction buff going. I don't really play that way. These ones over here are what I really need to keep an eye on. This is a melee speed buff, and this is a melee damage buff, and the only reason I know which one of these is which is that this is 60%, and that's the speed buff, because I know that it maxes out at 60%. Actually, it will always be either not active at all, or it'll be 60%, and this will always be not active, or it'll be 80%, and these have a countdown time. Well, there we're going to have some magnetic damage that's going to make the screen messy. And we probably noticed that these are going to, there we go, reset back up. So they're going to count down until they re-trigger, at which point that number is going to go up. So if we are playing a certain way, doing a certain thing, doing damage, taking damage, I can't even remember what triggers it. One of them, I think, triggers from taking damage yourself, and the other one triggers from doing critical damage. But the point is, we're going to get a speed to our attack in melee, and we're going to get extra damage in melee, and we want these to be active all the time. But do we really need to know? Like, I could probably tell that I can tell my attack speed is not being buffed. Also, somebody spent a lot of time making these icons really nice and ornate, and really it's irrelevant, because in the corner of your eye when you're playing the game, you can't even really see. All you're looking at is the 60 and 80, and really all I'm looking at again is these ones over here. This is the vigorous swap damage bust. This means my companion has picked up a health orb. This is magnetic damage reduction. Basically, I have a mod that gives me you build up immunities to certain damage types. So this is a late game mod that goes on your Warframe. It's called adaptation, and it will, as you take a certain kind of damage, your resistance to that damage increases. So this is a huge survivability increase. This yellow icon here is a particular kind of experience that I'm getting, something that's completely irrelevant to me at the stage of the game that I'm at, and does not need to be mixed in with these blue icons. So just jump ahead to some footage. This, you can see that a bunch of these buffs have actually timed out and gone away, and here we can actually watch, because I just take some time to stand in a corner for demonstration purposes. You can see these buffs, they time out. Now these ones will decrease one by one. The other ones just go away. These 60%, 80%, they're all or nothing. They're either being triggered or not. These ones, they decrease over time. Each time the timer goes out, they decrease by one. And you want to be keeping these. This matters, but it's, again, visual clutter, very hard to distinguish. A lot of information there. All I'm really looking at is the multipliers. I'm not looking at the timers. I'm not looking at the actual design of the icon. All I'm looking at is scanning this top row to see what those multiplier numbers are. So we're about to have a mini boss come out. This is why we're doing this sort of higher level mission. And I'm in a bit of a pickle, because I was, for the purpose of this video, I was standing over in the corner, and now the boss has come out, and I don't have my multipliers all where they should be. For this particular Warframe, in this particular context, it's not going to matter all that much. I'm going to kill him pretty quickly anyway. There we go, he's already dead. But you'll see now, once I've killed him, a whole bunch of these buffs are going to re-trigger, because they're dependent on killing enemies. So once I kill this boss, they re-trigger and they're there, but of course he's already dead, so it's kind of a little bit too late. The other thing I wanted to point out here is this nice big readout we get over here. So Wukong has two major abilities we're going to be using, and one of them is his Celestial Twin, which I don't know if I've got some good footage of that. But basically he has a second copy of himself. There he is standing over in the corner there. It's a bit hard to see. and fights alongside you, an AI control companion. This is separate from your Sentinel companion that I talked about before with Mirage, but it's a separate character in the game basically, and it has a certain amount of shields and health, and you can keep an eye on that, and it can actually die, although as you can see its health and shields are about 5 times what mine are. But it can die, and it's good to keep an eye on it and know that it's around. And for that, we get this big, nice, huge display. We're not stuck with some little blue icon up the top. We actually get a big, nice display for this. And then there's another ability, which I don't always have active all the time, but as soon as this Acolyte guy comes out, I'm going to use that ability, and it's going to give me a bunch of armor, which is yet more survivability so that this mini-boss won't kill me, because with some other frames, that is likely to happen. And it counts down, and while it's counting down, as you get, again, this big nice display, this big nice indicator that I know that 1500 is the maximum. It's not always guaranteed to get that 1500. But yeah, just keep an eye on the fact, because I'm going to come back in a minute, that this big nice display happens here, not these little blue icons up the top for that particular ability.
Still working on it. Continue to defend.
So here we've got another type of Warframe. This is Protea. In this particular mission, we do have some buffs that are being triggered by other Warframes in the game. She doesn't have a lot. These icons here are for her. I just happen to know that that's where they came from. But again, trying to see what's what and what's important. You can imagine, though, if we had as many icons going here as Wukong, plus icons from other Warframes, it gets very messy. The introductory video I showed back at the start of the video gets very, very messy. But I also wanted to point out that she has this nice big readout on the side here. She has a passive ability where, as she uses her abilities, she then gets a ability strength buff on her 4th time she uses whatever ability happens to be. It should say plus 100%. It's really basically doubling the power strength of whatever the ability that she's going to use next. This is a Warframe that relies heavily on abilities, but I'm trying to get my icons to appear, so I'm not really playing her the way I should be, because for the purpose of the video, I was trying to stack up a whole bunch of blue icons, which I really kind of struggled to do. But you'll notice how this icon here, which is really for her passive ability, gets a nice prominent display here. This is, I'm leading up to a point here, not relegated to blue icons up here. Now that this mini boss has come out, we can see there's a whole bunch of blue icons showing up, because the people in the game are actually starting to use their abilities. I might just go back and there we go. Most of these are from other Warframes in the vicinity. I also did not point out this blue thing here. It wasn't on the Wukong screen because I was playing solo. This is the affinity. This is to do with experience, and if you are within a certain range of other players in the game, you will get experience when they get kills. So basically, you don't have to be the one doing the killing specifically to get experience for that kill. And because there's 3 other players in the game and they're all within affinity range, that means it doesn't matter who kills the enemy, I will get experience for that. These icons here next to the individual player names actually tell us which player is in that affinity range. Affinity is just Warframe's word for XP. We really don't need to know that this is 3 and these are 3, and that somehow buried in all these icons here there happens to be this affinity icon. It's not telling us anything to do with our buffs or anything. It just happens to be stuck in here, and we could ascertain the same information from there. If I scroll back, we can see somewhere where, here we go, these 2 people are in range, this person's off doing who knows what, and we've got a 2 up here with that same icon. It's just doubling up information. We really don't need it. That could just disappear and it wouldn't impact the game at all. We still would have the information we need. So I mentioned before adaptation. So what I've done is actually I've built out a Warframe that doesn't have any of those buffs that the other Warframe had. This is purely adaptation. And this is by no means the most of these icons we could have on the screen. But imagine having all of that information on top of all of that information. And then imagine being in a mission with other Warframes whose abilities are giving you buffs, damage, protection, utility buffs, at some certain point, the game actually will only show you so many icons, I think. You know, that's an example of the sort of thing you can get. The red ones, by the way, that is status effects on your Warframe. So at this point in time, even though my Warframe has damage reduction against heat effects, is actually under a status effect for heat as well. And again, potentially you could have those stacked up as well. So I'm about to go back to talk about Mirage. And again, I just wanted to reiterate Wukong with his really big, nice display showing his ability, and Protea with her really nice big display showing her passive ability. Poor old Mirage has to make do with this tiny little blue icon up here, which is quite easy to see in this example, but believe me, in the most of the games I play, it's almost impossible to find this. This is her signature, her main ability. It's a straight up damage multiplier on top of every other damage multiplier that's going on. It's important that we know this number. This number will always be either 508 or 95, depending on how you've built her. Like for my build, it's always going to be 508 and 95. It's possible those numbers could be different. The reason why those numbers are so different from each other is that the 95 is actually a damage reduction effect, whereas the 508 is a damage multiplier. So depending on whether it's called Eclipse, depending on whether she's standing in the shadows or in the light, she's either going to have damage protection or damage increase. It would be really nice to be able to see that in a way that was actually able to be interpreted and controlled instead of being stuck up here on a little blue icon. This need to be a nice big output here where you can see what's going on. Her other ability is that she has these clones that fight alongside her, these holographic projections. That's pretty easy to keep track of when that's happening because, you know, that's a pretty big thing in the display. But here I am, I'm trying to find the point in the thing where I go from being a damage to being a, and you can see it flickering because it's like hasn't quite decided yet. The other thing, you do get this very, very faint sort of, see how she's kind of flickering in and out? It's practically impossible to see, but that's your other indication that you're, that's your big visual indication that she's getting a damage reduction and protection instead of getting the damage increase. I think when she gets the damage increase, she's got this sort of thick line around her. Not really so easy to see either. Point is that this frame desperately needs for this to be down here. And this is not the only frame that does this, by the way. Vault, who's an electricity-based frame, has like an electricity charge meter that's quite important to his abilities, also gets a tiny little icon up here. Meanwhile, frames like Wukong, Protea, there's a frame called Ember who does with fire, and she has a fire meter up here. There's a frame called Gauss, which is like also electricity or magnetism or something, and he has a big meter here on the side of the screen. A lot of frames that got a really nice big readout for their abilities to monitor what's going on, and then poor old Mirage and Vault have to make do with these tiny little blue icons up the top buried in everything else. Also should probably point out that this classic stack of 4 here, these are from what's called galvanized mods. These are from what are called weapon arcanes. That's not all that important, but these only came out 3 or 4 months ago. And most players of Warframe who are in the mid to late game who know what they're doing will have these things going on, and they'll have them going on all the time, and they'll want to keep track of whether they're active or not. This is basically in addition to whatever other icons they already had on the screen before that. So basically, DE have given us 4 more icons to keep an eye on and just plonked them down in the middle of a whole bunch of other icons. So maybe at some point in history these blue icons made sense. There's just way too many of them now. And finally, we're just going to have a quick look back at the original video and just to see, you know, we have attack speed buff, melee damage buff, buff to primary and secondary weapons that are dependent on enemy kills, buffs to primary and secondary weapons dependent on melee kills. The 2 icons that I really still don't know what they are the various Sentinel related buffs, as well as damage reduction against gas damage. I've got a gas status effect on me right now, and like Wukong has a gas and a cold status effect. And then this and this are from a frame called Wisp. I don't know who's playing Wisp from here, but it also, there's like a... Watch these things floating around. I've got these things that are orbiting around. That also tells me that I've got a buff from Wisp. Not to mention the fact that I just happen to know that this Wukong build does not have 1905 health. There's basically an additional 300 health comes from these buffs. And then there was this, which is, I think that's better shown later on. We've got a double stack. This is from the other two frames, happen to be the same Warframe called Mesa, who gives you a damage buff to your ranged weapons. In this particular case, both of them are giving me a buff. Do I need to know that that buff is there? Do I need to know that that buff is on a countdown timer? Is that helping me in any way? Do I need to know that this Wisp thing is on a countdown timer? Or if it's infinity, I think it means I'm standing within the range of where there's like these things that they put down, and that gives you the thing. And if you stay within range of the moat thing, it stays active, and as soon as you go away, it starts counting down. Do I need to know that, really? Anyway, this is Wukong. This is late game gameplay with a full squad, with a whole bunch of buffs from him and a whole bunch of other buffs from other people, status effects, all this sort of stuff. It is a complete nutter visual mess. Okay, so I'm just going to pull up some notes here and summarize the issues here and what I think we can do about them. Number one, get rid of this affinity icon. It doesn't need to be here. It doesn't belong. It doesn't need to be moving around and shuffled in with everything else. We can already see what the affinity is. We can see where people are on the map. We have other ways of telling people whether they're in affinity range or not. And honestly, most players of Warframe probably don't even know what that icon means anyway. Second thing would be these kind of status effects need to be somewhere else. They don't need to be popping in and out of this information. They could be over here. They could be over here near the health bar. Do we really need the numbers next to them? Do we really care how many of those stacks we've got on us? Most of the time I could just say I don't even need to know at all. It very rarely would impact on gameplay. How about some color coding on these, or organize them in some kind of sensible order, like maybe one row for damage buffs and one row for protection buffs and one row for utility buffs. Some kind of sensible where we could at least narrow down when we're looking for a particular thing that we want to find out information on, that it would be in a particular place, not just anywhere in this mishmash of icons. Number one, even above all of that, above any of it, but probably a little bit harder to implement, would be just give me the ability to turn them off. I do not need to know that Mesa is giving me a buff. I do not need both of these icons here. If I had one of them, I can infer what the other one is going to be. Same thing with pretty much these two here. If I had one active, the other one's probably going to be active. These things here, again, I can infer the existence of one from the existence of the other. I could just switch one of them off. These things that are to do with my companion having picked up energy orbs or whatever else is going on, don't care, don't need to know. I'll assume it's happening, and if it's not happening, I'll know because I'll be running out of energy, for example. Buff from Wisp, don't need to know that either because I can tell when my health is higher. New players might want that information, but new players probably don't know what it means, so why are you telling them? And things like adaptation, again, adaptation buffs should be somewhere else, or in some little box or something that makes it clear that that's from adaptation. And do I really need to know when it's ticking down or whatever? Like, that would be another thing. Just give me the ability to disable all of the countdown timers. Just one button to switch all of them off. I very rarely care. I know that with these buffs that require me to be making kills all the time, I know they're going away. I'm trying to regularly kill enemies consistently. This is a new thing in the meta since they did the damage rework a few months ago, that you have to be constantly killing enemies to maintain these buffs if you want to be maximizing your damage output. It's a gameplay mechanism that suits the style of the game, but I don't need a whole bunch of numbers here constantly counting down to remind me of that fact. So give me the ability to disable specific icons. Give me the ability to turn off countdown timers. Color code things so that it makes a little bit more visual sense and you can kind of find the icon you want, put them in some sort of sensible order so they're not just constantly being shuffled around. And for goodness sake, give Volt and Mirage a proper, nice, big indicator for their main abilities here where they can see it, not hidden away up here. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, all that stuff.